Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this special celebratory panel event. And I would like to call on Professor Sarah Whatmore, who has kindly joined us from the School of Archaeology and the Social Sciences Division to formally open our event. Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Hi, Lynn. Nice to see you. It's been an age. So it's fantastic. And thank you, Amy, for inviting me just to say a very few words, really to signal the importance of this event in the wider division and the university. Work on heritage, and particularly the kind of cross-disciplinary tracks into and through heritage for archaeology, history, geography, anthropology, a whole range of departments and disciplines is a really active and important space. The more so, I think, because in these strange times that have us all online, rather than being able to see one another in person, public confidence in spaces like museums, landscapes that are part of heritage, trails and so on, is sadly out of practice. And I'm sure you will have many ideas that will enable, once we come out of lockdown, the re-engagement with all those publics who are so important to making heritage a valued and an active part of our public lives. It's also a very happy moment to be celebrating and honouring the Centenary of Women at Oxford. Yeah, don't dwell too long on that period of time or that date, given that we're an 800-year-old institution, but nonetheless helpful and useful to celebrate the Centenary of Women at Oxford. And that includes many very pioneering archaeologists and historians who were women through those years. And in celebration of that, Amy's done a fantastic job in assembling an all-female panel. How good is that? So that we can celebrate the range and diversity of current contributions to the study of heritage in Oxford and beyond. And panelists may also want to reflect, perhaps then, in the context of that centenary, what has happened in that century of change. Because certainly we have seen a great deal of change. Amy is head of department. She's not the first woman in archaeology to be head of department, but it's a great moment in the school, I think, for the input and contributions from women in the school. It's also, of course, International Women's Week, let's call it. The actual day has passed, but that's an additional bonus for your conversations. And then lastly, I just wanted to obviously draw attention to the fact, and my own personal delight in the fact, that this event formally kicks off Lynn's time with us over the next little period. Lynn Meskell, who has spent some time with us before, but on this occasion will be joining us over the next 3 years as an honorary visiting professor. I'm delighted to hear that news, and for this event to mark the beginning of your time with us. I think every panelist we have with us will have fascinating things to say on this topic. The heritage intersection theme is also very much one of Lynn's areas of interest and strength. And I've no doubt at all we're going to be having a fascinating conversation over the next hour or so. So welcome everybody, virtually at least, to Oxford. It's fantastic to have you with us talking about this really timely and important topic. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And I just want to say my thanks to the panel for making themselves available this afternoon, and to this Oxford audience, who I think will have a number of questions for us to consider. And I wanted to mention to the audience that you will have seen at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A prompt, and you are welcome to start typing questions at any point. We have a certain set of topics that we want to cover as a panel, but towards the end of our time, we will turn to Q&A, and I'll be chairing those questions as well. Of course, I want to now introduce each panelist to you, and the way I'm going to do that is as I bring each person in to consider an initial question. And that initial question is, how have each of these panelists arrived at heritage as a public good, even a basic human need, as we're going to hear, but how have they arrived at that topic through their academic research? And I'm going to do this in alphabetical order, starting with Professor Roberta Gilchrist. Roberta is Professor of Archaeology and Dean of Research for Heritage and Creativity at the University of Reading. She is closely involved in applied heritage work through projects at medieval sites in the UK, including architectural conservation, heritage management, and public interpretation. And one of her current projects, for example, is on Glastonbury Abbey, where she's been considering the intersection of archaeology with medieval and contemporary myth, spiritual belief, and multivocality. Roberta has worked closely with a range of heritage institutions in the UK, including the National Trust, the British Museum, the Museum of London Archaeology, and Historic England. And Roberta, I thought you might start us off by saying a bit about how your doctoral work, which I believe was on medieval religious women, how that led you actually towards applied and public heritage.
Thanks, Amy, and hello everyone, including Eleanor's cat that briefly briefly passed through during the introduction. Yeah, so my interest in heritage now today is around the intersection between heritage and the sacred, and heritage and gender, but I didn't start out with a specific plan in that direction. My aim when I went into archaeology was really to work principally on gender, and my PhD research on gender in medieval archaeology was quite a difficult thing to start because people hadn't really worked on gender at that time. And I thought, I know, I'll look at nuns, religious women, that'll be really easy, not realizing how difficult that was going to be. But in the process of doing that, I had to learn about medieval Christian heritage, and that turns out to be quite a specialist endeavor. So I had to learn about buildings archaeology and buildings conservation, and quite a lot of ethical issues around working with heritage that is linked to living religions and buildings still in use for Christian worship. So when I really started out my academic career, partly as an ACR, as a PhD student, I developed what was a scarce skill in sacred heritage, and started being asked to do a lot of consultancy work and sort of expert work for heritage agencies, for religious communities, and so on. So I did that work in parallel with the work that I'm better known for, which I think is around gender archaeology, the archaeology of the life course, etc. So I had these sort of two lives going on, one of which was theoretical and social archaeology, and is really, I think, what I was pushed to do by my universities, that was the kind of academic work that they wanted me to do. And then I had this sort of sideline, which today we call a side hustle, I suppose, where I was doing all of this really practical conservation heritage and also public heritage work. And the two never really kind of came together, you know, until fairly recently. I'd say in the last 10 years or so, and especially in my publications in the last year or two, I've brought together the more theoretical and the practical heritage work. So now, you know, my most recent book is on sacred heritage. I've been co-authoring articles on gender and the interpretation of medieval castles, but I've come quite late to that, to be able to combine those two things. And it's, I think, quite interesting as to why I couldn't do it previously. It was partly the nature of heritage work that it's much broader today, how we define the field of heritage, and it's possible to bring these things together and to be talking about sacred beliefs and heritage and gender all together. But also the professional context for me. I was pushed, I think, encouraged to do a certain type of archaeology that was more valued, whereas suddenly 10 years ago, universities started to be concerned about impact in a way that they weren't previously. And that work I was doing was much more valued by my institution than it had been previously. And that has kind of given me the intellectual and professional space to engage with heritage in a way that I hadn't done previously.
We're off to a great start. Thanks, Roberta. And I would next call on Helena Hamerow. Professor Helena Hamerow is our early medieval archaeologist here in the School of Archaeology in Oxford. Helena is currently Commissioner for Historic England and also leads an ERC advanced project on early medieval farming. Helena is also a member of the Historic England Advisory Committee and the Historic Environment Conservation Committee, two very similarly named bodies, Helena. And I wanted to ask, through your work on UK heritage sites, especially your early medieval settlement research, and now as Commissioner for Historic England, how have you found it working with HE, with Historic England, from an academic perspective? Are you allowed to say?
Am I allowed to say? Well, first of all, thank you, Amy. Thank you for inviting me to this. And I should say maybe first that unlike I think the other panelists, I'm really more a consumer of heritage research rather than a producer of heritage research. So I'm going to really be very interested and learn a lot, I think, by participating in this. I mean, like Roberta, I first engaged with issues around archaeology and heritage, or was forced, I suppose, to confront those issues as a doctoral student. I was working on a now infamous site called Mucking in Essex, which scarred a whole generation of British archaeologists who excavated there. Mucking was basically a piece of what used to be called rescue archaeology before the idea of development-led archaeology had ever been kind of invented or thought of. So this was before the developer pays and so on. It was something that started as a small-scale excavation in advance of gravel quarrying. It was directed by someone who was not a professional archaeologist. It was surveyed from a plow furrow, and then it just grew and grew and grew as the quarry grew, and ended up being the largest excavation in the UK for many years and one of the largest in Europe. And so working on that, albeit in a kind of post-excavation, academic capacity, kind of forced me to confront some of the very difficult issues that arose in that sort of situation in the context of development archaeology. And of course, now the world has changed completely, and planning law has changed, and there's statutory protection and so on. So back then, the public bodies, this is the 1980s, the public body responsible for mucking and for the whole historic environment in England was the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission, which we now call Historic England. So now I find myself on the commission as, interestingly, and this was a big surprise to me, virtually the only commissioner who is an academic. So I am very much trying to make sense of that intersection between heritage and academic discipline. So the theme of this panel is absolutely pertinent. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, but that's how I came to be on the commission.
Nina, thank you very much. And I'm now going to move on to Rachael Kiddey. Rachael is British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow here at the School of Archaeology in Oxford. She's working currently on a project called Migrant Materialities that I think we will hear more about in due course. Her research combines anthropological and archaeological approaches to the contemporary past, including the engagement of diverse publics in cultural heritage work and developing approaches to contemporary social issues. And Rachael, it would be great to hear more about how your research into the contemporary past has led you to engage with heritage since your doctoral work, I think, since your work with homeless communities in Bristol. How did you get started on that path?
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, I did a master's at Bristol in historical archaeology, and where I read a lot of Lynn Meskell, among others. To be perfectly honest, it blew my mind. It completely changed the way I saw the world, and that's not too profound to say that. That's what actually happened. I said we were reading about well, it's kind of post 1500, so it was really historical archaeology of the world post 1500. But then the conversations I had with reading, we had amazing seminars. We did lots of oh, can you still hear me? Because my thing just came up saying my internet is unstable. Was okay?
No, you're fine, we've got you. Yep.
Oh, good. Anyway, so during that master's, I really started to look at everything differently, look at colonialism, look at the way that history was taught to us at school, look at museum interpretation. And it just sort of melded in my mind. And then after my master's, I went back to work at the BBC, making documentaries for Radio 4, Radio 3 on largely sort of social issues and reinterpreting history. So I made a program in, must have been the early 2000s, questioning Black History Month, and I received loads and loads of emails saying I was racist for questioning it, but actually the point that we were making is the point that we're making, I think, more effectively now with things like Black Lives Matter, that we shouldn't have Black history. There should be history, and we shouldn't have, you know, a day for women and a month for Black history. So kind of combining what I'd learned on my master's and then going to work as a program maker again and applying some of that theory, making programs, I found myself cycling through Bristol just pre the financial crash. It was about 2006, 2007. And I was really cross because all around the sort of poorer part of Bristol where I was working and lived, there were these huge kind of development signs saying, buy an apartment, only £199,000. And people who lived locally had no hope of being able to buy apartments like that. And I just felt very cross and very frustrated. And I bumped into a friend who was going to a planning meeting at the council house, and went to the council house and had my 2 minutes and kind of harnessed everything I'd learned about heritage and the way in which people and place and things and the way those relationships work and heritage's role in that. And I got on my soapbox and said what I had to say, and then that turned into a job. So a chap who was in Bristol came out of the audience and said, I need someone who can speak like you do about things like that. Come and work for me. So I went to sort of work as a community activist. My parents were horrified because I just sort of jacked in my BBC job and went to become an anarchist. But that's where that started. And it was through that role, through working with people. We worked with everyone in the community. We worked on art projects, we worked with academics, we worked with homeless people, we worked with anyone who came along. We said, you know, this is what we're doing. And it was sort of cheeky art projects, stroke heritage, to make people, to tell people what was going on in terms of local planning, and things like various big shops, like, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but we campaigned against Tesco, and it was about protecting and reinvigorating and re-empowering local people to say, are you happy with this, or do you want your entire local community to look like any other high street, or is there something special about here? So it was very much about place, and that's how I met homeless people, and then that project sort of grew very organically from those meetings.
Rachael, that's an amazing set of circumstances that led you there. Thanks so much. And our next panelist that I'd like to introduce is Lynn Meskell, who, as you've heard, has joined us now as honorary visiting professor at Oxford, and that's for the next 3 years. Lynn, like many of our panelists, wears several hats, so get ready for this. She is Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also Richard D. Green Professor of Anthropology in the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor in the Graduate Program in Historic Preservation and Curator in the Middle East and Asia sections at the Penn Museum. She is currently A.D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University. And as well as the visiting professorship here in Oxford, Lynn also holds honorary professorships at Liverpool University, Shiv Nadar University, India, and the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. And Lynn, we would love to hear now about your academic journey, perhaps towards the work that you've done in UNESCO.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you for suggesting arranging this, and thanks also to Sarah for being here, and all the panelists. It's a great group, really fantastic. So yeah, being trained in Australia, it's just really not possible to do archaeology that is somehow separated from heritage work. And I guess I always did the two things at once, even perhaps without realizing that. I always did 2 projects at any one time, whether it was, working in Egypt and then working on Mediterranean issues around figurines and things, working in Turkey, working in South Africa, working on UNESCO, now working in India. So, putting all of those things together that inform, projects that inform each other. And so the sociopolitics of archaeology have always fascinated me. And when I think back, quite a few years ago now, but my first book, Archaeology Under Fire, was about archaeologists working in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, and it was about their responsibility. So it wasn't just about nationalism and how people use our materials, archaeological materials. It was very much our responsibilities and roles that we've played, and that somehow stayed with me. And like many of our other speakers, it wasn't something that I strategically sought out to do. It just developed. So I've always had these sort of 2 strands and 2 interests, and even now, 2 projects that deal with the Middle East and India. So yeah, it's that sort of political, I guess, the sort of post-colonial, sort of angry Australian thing. I always say to my students, everything I write comes out of anger, which is probably not very healthy, but true. And so yeah, actually it was Chris Gosden who suggested, if he's here, who suggested that I do the UNESCO project. I was finishing up a book on South Africa, and I just said, it's such an amazing thing, this entire organization that has archaeological sites listed on its World Heritage list, but I don't know that archaeologists really understand how it works, and we don't seem to be involved in the agency at all. And I think this would be a great dissertation for a student to do. And he said, why don't you do it? And I said, oh, I'm totally not capable. And yet I staggered on. And I happened to be in Paris while I was finishing the South Africa book. I met somebody at a dinner who worked at UNESCO, and then it went from there. And, because of Chris, I also then looked at the history of archaeology with UNESCO, which was huge. And so there was a whole hidden history there of major, mainly British, major archaeologists, mainly men, but not always. Jaquetta Hawkes was in there too, who were instrumental at the founding of UNESCO and in the early years, and then dropped out. So I think if I hadn't been an archaeologist, and if I'd just done the ethnographic work, it would be a very different project and a very, very different book. So, I think all that archaeological training, whether it's the attention to history, to returning to field sites, the longitudinal studies, and also, the quantification that's needed, and the interdisciplinary work, to work with lawyers and economists and political scientists. I think that's been invaluable. I feel very lucky. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And I can now introduce you to Sada Mire. Sada is a cultural theorist who has made the case that cultural heritage is a basic human need, including in times of conflict. She works in Somalia and Somaliland and is presenter and writer of a Leiden University course entitled Heritage Under Threat. And her new book is entitled Divine Fertility, the Continuity and Transformation of an Ideology of Sacred Kinship in Northeast Africa. And Sada, I would be grateful if you could tell us more about how your academic research has led you to the conviction around, cultural heritage as a basic human need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for inviting me and everyone in the panel. It's really a pleasure to take part. Sorry about my voice. I've got a cold or flu, and hopefully we'll get through this and you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Okay. So the notion of coming to the conclusion of heritage being a basic human need was my trajectory could not have been far from that, because I came to Europe as a 15-year-old refugee. And when I was studying Scandinavian history, I just started thinking about, I don't know much about African history. I wonder what that is like. So I decided to study in archaeology to understand African history. And then I came to research Somali archaeology, and I realized there was no information about it. The region was just a black, dark spot with terrorism, famine, war, And there were just some sporadic research done during independence or colonial times. And I wanted to understand what was, what was happening before, and realized that actually there were museums, they were destroyed during the war and looted. And also archaeological sites had been destroyed. So I thought, okay, that's where I'll start from. But then at the same time, I found myself in a situation where a lot of people were questioning, Somalia, and what is Somaliland? It's not what people were expecting. And then that academic research into the history of heritage management, history of archaeology in the region, following from colonial times, independence times, and then later, taught me that actually the way that cultural heritage had been approached had been very much top-down approach. First through the colonial times, when no real infrastructure was put in place, followed by the independence, which had three things going on. One was the new initiative with UNESCO funding random African countries to develop museums, including Somalia. And then you had archaeology continuing in the region as African archaeology in the 80s became more of a field. And then also the nationalist narrative in Africa, in newly independent countries. And all of these systems of historiography and engagement really did not explain to me why we landed at this situation where we know nothing about. And I started doing ethnographic research, asking Somali people simply, what is your heritage? Because when I talked about archaeology, they knew nothing about it. They knew nothing about artifacts that have been lost, sites that have been destroyed. And it's only by asking them what is heritage, and immediately, I'm an archaeologist, so this is how I got into heritage, because if they don't know archaeology, then what is your heritage? What is your sense of self, identity? And that led me to exploring really the way of life, people explaining to me their own perspectives on heritage and identity, the skills they have, how they live. And that the idea then emerged that actually we are talking about different ontologies of heritage. But then I also started reflecting on what this meant for these people, and understanding that there were correlations between how I survived the civil war at the age of 14, just all of a sudden we are, we hear bombs in Mogadishu and we leave our house, we are running out of our town, pushing our grandmother in a wheelbarrow, and end up in these landscapes. And what made us survive was the skills we learned while we would in the summers spend time with our grandmother. So all of a sudden we know, oh, you go there to get that kind of material. You go to that tree. Oh, you cut yourself. Go to this acacia tree or that aloe tree. So all of these elements that were being instilled in us, not from the books, but the living experiences of these nomads that my grandmother was, then made me understand the information that I was getting ethnographically from people. Because by that time, I must say, I had become a Westerner. I'd spent 15 years in Sweden, so I was very much looking at things from very much archaeological, organized. I was just expecting everything to be orderly, Stone Age, Iron Age, Bronze Age, you have museums, things are in order. But it completely changed my view. And then again, when I started looking at why are these landscapes then important? I realized that actually it was very much about the immaterial. It was relationships between the material and the human beings. That immaterial relationship, that sense, that actually is part of what I later then researched further in my book, Divine Fertility, looking at landscapes, sacred landscapes, and also a human being. And a human being is a thinking being. So you don't only need food to survive, you need something that motivates you from getting up out of bed, doing something or trying to survive. You have to have a narrative in your head why you matter, who you are. And I think that is completely inseparable. Through my further research, it became completely inseparable from heritage, which is then a narrative or a meaning to how you narrate, how you identify yourself. And in my classes as a professor at Leiden or other places, when I researched and I asked students to just write about what you think is your heritage. And I didn't want to take, the tulips of the Netherlands or the Stonehenge when I was in England as an answer. I wanted them to tell me about things. And they would really start thinking and come up with things that really mattered to them. And I think it's along those lines that I realized that we are actually talking about much more acute things than just bricks and mortar.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you, Sada. And I'd now like to introduce our next panelist, Himanshu Prabha. Himanshu is Research Fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, and she is former chair, I believe the first ever chair, of the National Monuments Authority of India, and was professor at the Center for Historical Studies in New Delhi. She edits the Archaeology and Religion in South Asia Routledge series, including a 2016 volume entitled Decolonizing Heritage in South Asia, the Global, the National, and the Transnational. And Himanshu, we would be fascinated to hear about your perspective as, I believe, the first ever chair of the National Monuments Authority of India that was established in 2011. How did your academic background prepare you for that?
Thank you, Amy. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and thank you, panelists, for this exciting evening. To answer your question, Amy, my academic background did not prepare me, for the job that I ended up doing. And I was trained in archaeology. My interests were in Buddhism, sacred heritage, sacred archaeology. I'd done history of archaeology and worked on Mortimer Wheeler. And, he was the first not the first, at the time of Indian independence, he was the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, which is a government institution. And I was very peacefully teaching in the, teaching in the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and had applied for a research position with the Ministry of Culture. And I'm not sure, I never got the research position, but I got, I was asked to come for an interview, and I was offered the job of the chairperson of the National Monuments Authority, which had been set up in 2011. Now, let me just digress a bit and tell you why it was set up. India was, under British rule for a long time. Our laws, our heritage laws are all British laws. So the first, the first act that was promulgated was 1904 by John Marshall. And we've kind of, even after independence, we've never really thrown that out of the window and got our own laws, and which I think is a major problem, but never mind. So that law was updated and validated in 2010. Why was it validated? It was validated because now suddenly there was a lot of construction as the cities were growing. There was a lot of construction activity around monuments, around the nationally protected monuments, and the government suddenly tried to clamp down and introduce a law in Parliament in 2010, which regulated this construction activity around monuments. And now comes the problem. Now, so they set up this National Monuments Authority and need a chairperson. I need somebody, well, I didn't know at that time, maybe I would have thought about it more, but they needed an academic, to, how should one say, to legitimize this whole sort of endeavor. So anyway, long and short of it is I took it up. And like Helena, I found myself, the only academic amongst administrators. I had no clue what to do with the Ministry of Culture or, the many ministries one needs to deal with. And besides, this was a regulatory authority. It was an administrative position, not something which I was prepared during my academic training. But having reached there, I thought, why not get academics into this, and why not get administrators to look at something else rather than what they want me to look at. So that was really the challenge, how to get people, ordinary people, to understand that we will not give them permission to build around a monument because the monument is nationally protected. I mean, that's not easy. Delhi has 174 nationally protected monuments in residential areas. And it's not easy trying to persuade people not to build around monuments. So anyway, so there was the need to publicize. There was the need to get people to understand something beyond, this sort of very colonial narrative of, okay, this is a monument, that's it. I'm saying so, go home, don't build. And that's really, which started this whole journey with looking at World Heritage sites, getting people to talk on monuments, why preserve monuments, and so on. But the one part which I really enjoyed, and which was, I think, the sort of high point of my stay in the National Monuments Authority was that in 2014, so really, I was there around 3 years already. The government of India decided that they now wanted to do a transnational project with UNESCO. And one of the things they wanted to do was maritime, a maritime networks, maritime cultural landscapes project. And so they asked me whether, I was willing to go and make a presentation and, talk about this. I had worked on maritime archaeology and maritime history, so I was really delighted. But what I didn't realize then was, that's how academics kind of get used by administrators. Sorry for that. But anyway, I did my preparation and made that presentation. This was at the 2014 Doha meeting, at which I think Lynn was also there, and where Project Mosam was launched. This was Government of India's transnational project on maritime links across the Indian Ocean. I thought it was a great project, and I thought it got great support. The only small problem was, the governments think very differently, and the ministries think very differently. So the project hasn't. So that's my regret. The project didn't move forward. But anyway, I did enjoy my stay. I did do my little bit at pushing a database on monuments, at getting some publicity on monuments, also organizing exhibitions and conferences on World Heritage sites. So that's how I reached, and that's what I sort of tried to use my academic training in broadening out what was essentially an administrative position. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I can see a theme developing here of creative adaptation to challenges of being in these very demanding positions. Thank you. And our last panelist is Eleanor Robson. Eleanor is professor of ancient Middle Eastern history and head of the history department now at the University College London. She directs the Iraq-centered Nahrain network, which works with academic and non-academic partners to develop the capacity of Middle Eastern universities, museums, archives, and cultural heritage sites to foster cultural and economic growth in the region. And the network was recently awarded a gobsmacking 11 million philanthropic gift to fund an expanded range of research, advocacy, and capacity building that will take you to 2031, I believe, Eleanor. And I would love to know how your academic research, which I believe began on ancient Middle Eastern mathematics, how that led to the Nahrain network.
Oh, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Lynn, especially for inviting me here. It's a long story and I'll try to keep it short. It's a story that begins in Oxford in the early 90s, where I was doing my DPhil in Oriental Studies in what Fergus Miller then described me as being the ultimate academic, because I worked on Babylonian mathematics, and the implication was that it was completely blooming useless, that's a slip of the tongue. But I came to Oxford in 1990, just at the point that Iraq and the United States were gearing up for the 1991 war. Jeremy Black, my dearly beloved and much missed DPhil supervisor, had just arrived in Oxford too after a long time working in Iraq as the field director of what was then the British School of Archaeology in Iraq. And he spent the 90s when I was a graduate student and a postdoc in Oxford, basically rescuing Iraqi colleagues from Saddam and from sanctions. And so I grew up really with the sense of a moral obligation to the country, that we should be treating it with respect and our colleagues with respect, and that it was a privilege to be working on that country and it wasn't ours. And yet paradoxically, I couldn't set foot in there. The first time I went to Iraq was with Jeremy in 2001. That was really just a mind-blowing experience. It completely revolutionized the way I think. It was only sort of 10 days there, but I met so many people that have remained sort of lifelong friends and colleagues. Moved from Oxford and the world, the very sort of beautifully nerdy world of Oriental Studies, to a very different disciplinary context in 2004, to Cambridge, to the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. And there I was really, it was incredible actually to be able to put a theoretical framework around sort of ideas that I was fumbling towards around the social and political context of the creation of knowledge in antiquity. Really drawing very heavily on sociologists and historians of technoscience in much more recent periods, but a lot of the stuff pertained. It was fantastic. At the same time, Iraq War, Jeremy died. It was a huge loss. He was really almost family. And trying to think about how I lived up to his standards, and yet having years without contact with Iraqi colleagues because of the awful aftermath of the 2003 war. Things started to change about 10 years ago. My personal circumstances also changed, and I was, for both of those reasons, able to get back to Iraq, and I jumped at it, and Iraqi colleagues were inviting me. I think I was probably one of the very few international academics in Iraq at that point. And I felt I would be giving a talk on ancient Iraqi history, and realizing at that time my Arabic was non-existent. So I was speaking in English, presenting what was essentially local history to incredibly well-educated people. But because of their exclusion from the production of knowledge for the past 30, 40 years, because of the awful history of their country, I had access to all this research, this primary resources and the theoretical tools that they simply didn't. And it was, they loved it and they were just gorgeous, but I just felt absolutely rotten about it. It was just felt so uncomfortable. Did some work at the time with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, which was the old archaeology school's successor. We made some progress there. Essentially, Cambridge really wasn't the place for doing work in Iraq. They really weren't supportive. Yeah, I think Very old institutions are marvelous in lots of ways, but they're quite hard to turn around in their ways of doing things, let's say. And the opportunity came to move to UCL and to move to a history department, and which was just brilliant. And UCL is very international and very open to new ideas, and they just jumped at it. And in fact, I arrived for the interview off the plane from an Iraqi visit by pure coincidence, and I've just kind of written the job talk on the way home. So that just gave me the environment just to be open about working in Iraq rather than having to apologise for it or taking it as leave, which is what I was having to do at Cambridge. And then some of you know about the Global Challenges Research Fund, which was a government creation about 5 years ago and is now dying a very horrible death. But working with my lovely colleagues from Oxford, Paul Collins, who I see is here, hi Paul, and Moody al-Rashid, we kind of capitalised on the work that Paul and I had been thinking about in the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, and just applied for a grant to just bring together all the people that we've been working with and enable them to do the sorts of work that they wanted to do around, for them deciding what mattered for their history and heritage, rather than, particularly in the aftermath of ISIS-Daesh, lots of international funders are coming and saying, we will rebuild this important site, we will tell you what matters here, you know, or we will, you know, threaten to remove your antiquities. And all of the local expertise was being completely ignored, and there was a lot of really awful colonialist practice. And so what our grant does is basically acknowledge that, yeah, I'm a very good manager and raiser of funds and have a great, incredible network now, and I enable other people to do the research that they want to do and operationalize that to make, to decide what matters in a hyper-local sense, and to help them just find their work on their own history and heritage, being taken seriously both within the country and internationally. And at the same time, our network does a lot of work with funders, such as ALIF and the European Union, and with policy organisations such as Chatham House, because it's for all, you could spend all your time supporting grassroots efforts, but if the infrastructure isn't there to really embed that and make sustainable and for people to understand why it's important, then nothing is going to happen. So we do a lot of fantastic bottom-up stuff, and then there's the top-down work with the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, with various government departments in this country, etc., to make things happen. And meanwhile, I still continue to be a nerdy Assyriologist and doing my nerdy work on cuneiform tablets. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Eleanor, thanks so much. These are such rich statements. Really appreciate that. And I can see you're all, in a sense, living double lives, the public heritage life alongside other strands of research. And another question we wanted to consider here is heritage as a cross-disciplinary space, as Sarah framed it at the outset, and that is both within and beyond the heritage sector. And Lynn, I wondered if you would like to comment on how you see that developing.
Yeah, I think it was an American archaeologist, maybe it was Jim Dietz, actually a very long time ago, said that every archaeologist has to be a diplomat, a fundraiser, a politician, as well as an excavator and everything else. And I do think, just listening to people talk today, and the sorts of themes and issues are incredibly sobering and wide-ranging. And so we do have to deal with, increasingly we have to deal with not just social and political issues, but issues of human rights. So that gets us into things like international law, as I said, political science, economics. You know, there are many, many dimensions of it. And I'm kind of old-fashioned in that I'm not really sure what the discipline of heritage is. And as I mentioned before, I'm actually quite pleased. I never didn't want to be an archaeologist, as it were, even if I did anthropological ethnographic work. So I actually think we do need that training, whether that's in archaeology, history, geography, or sociocultural anthropology. We need that. I'm not sure that heritage studies unmoored from a methodology is terribly useful. And so it's not just that we have to know our own field, but we have to be aware of other disciplines and other strengths. And really all of the panelists, whether it's working with government agencies, dealing with refugee issues, human rights issues, civic rights issues, and just the sort of internationalism, the way that has impacted all of our lives, our careers, our work, the people that we work with, and not to mention things like war and conflict. So in a sense, we need to be anchored in disciplines, but then we also have to work with networks and teams of people who are also skilled in those other fields and really do something different. And my aim would be that we also up our intellectual stakes, like the discussions that we've had today, that archaeology isn't something colonial, it's not just about a hole in the ground somewhere, that the stakes have really changed. And I think this panel is a great example of that.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And Himanshu, I wonder if I can ask you to come in there, because that broad multidisciplinary training that one may receive will happen then not only in the context of a formal university course, but also potentially being put in the very heavy position that you had as chair of the NMA.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, in India, I think heritage still, gets attention from primarily 2 or 3 sectors. And I am assuming that this happens elsewhere as well, but not so sure. One is tourism. So, why preserve heritage? Heritage is largely for tourism, for the hospitality industry, for conservation architects, so that's the NGO sector. And there's also, especially with all the urban problems and urban planning, there is a great deal of interest from real estate agents and from developers and so on. In India, what one misses, and I think I'm not sure how to sort of really put that together in an academic discipline. But I do think that in universities, in colleges, and in history and archaeology departments, it would seem as if the world of heritage is quite apart from all of this. And I think there is a problem there. You cannot divorce. I mean, I agree with Lynn that, by itself, there is no methodology of theory of heritage as such. But departments which teach history, archaeology, or even anthropology, sociology, and law for that matter. I mean, a lot of international law gets related to heritage. So I think that there is particularly in India, there is no public discourse. It's all, it's all the government decides what heritage is all about, what should be protected. Now, how does one then bring in the public discourse unless the universities and the colleges intervene? Otherwise it just remains at the level of fine, the state does what in its wisdom it wants to do. And one agrees or disagrees, but that's very different from really engaging with issues and really drawing up the issues to the attention of a larger audience. And the other thing that I think is missing, and again, is something that we need to bring in, is an alternative view of heritage, an alternative view of monuments. What do the locals think? Do they, does it matter what they think? I mean, does one need to incorporate that? So I think that there are sort of several dimensions of taking both monuments and heritage forward. And I think this was a lesson which I learned moving away from the university into the real world of passing conservation laws or heritage bylaws or dealing with urban planners, is that unless there is this larger awareness, and I'm really talking about India, things are not going to change. And at another level, I do think that institutions like UNESCO do not help. They are sort of, again, more technical. and enforce a certain regime, which is not what we need. What we need is a dynamic, vibrant situation where the many stakeholders can really intervene, interact, and discuss how to take this forward. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Himanshu. And that actually brings me to a question I will frame initially to Roberta. So we've been thinking about the contributions that academic disciplines with an interest in the past can make to this cross-disciplinary space and to this public conversation. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your interest in place and placemaking, particularly in the context of the pandemic and of the issue of increasing confidence in public spaces as we move, we hope, beyond the pandemic. Roberta.
Okay, in a UK context, I suppose the pandemic has really emphasized the vulnerability of museums and heritage sites, and they will be fighting to survive, really. And so I think they are very keen on collaborating with others, and there is an onus upon us, I think, to work with them, to think about how they can respond and recover economically and socially. It draws quite a lot on Himanshu's comments as well about bringing together different perspectives and drawing on some of our more kind of theoretical skills as archaeologists and heritage theorists. So it isn't just a matter of helping them to celebrate particular places by bringing in archaeological information and filling in the gaps, but it's really important to help them to think through things like multivocality, different perspectives on a particular place, to think through cultural sensitivities and ethical issues as well. And I'm working on two projects at the moment. I'll just give you some examples of this. I think it does help sometimes to give examples. For example, really close to me in terms of my university, I'm at the University of Reading. I'm working with Reading Abbey, Reading Borough Council, who are very keen to work on this particular site as part of their economic regeneration. This will be their focal point for placemaking activities that have been funded by Historic England. Reading Abbey is in a public space somewhere called the Forbury Gardens. That may sound familiar to some of you because it was the site of a terrorist attack last June. 3 people very sadly lost their lives, and it's caused a lot of trauma within the community. So we have the key heritage space, which we want to get people to come back to. We need to learn about its archaeology, and that's why they wanted me involved in the first place. But now we also have to think through, how do you interpret a sacred heritage site, which has this sort of troubled recent past as well as a kind of deeper history? Should we be looking at, say, comparative world religions and thinking about how we approach the idea of commemoration and loss and sacred heritage? So it's become a very different project, one which is kind of moved from mapping the archaeology and informing the interpretation to one where we have to sort of think through what this all means in terms of emotion and trauma. The other work I'm doing is with Glastonbury Abbey, where I've been working for quite a long time, but there the pandemic has had a very specific impact. It's a site which has to earn its own living. It has to pay for itself by bringing in paying visitors, and of course they aren't around. It's also used to focusing its interpretation on museums and on tours. You can't do those sort of things. So we're trying to shift it towards open air interpretation, self-led interpretation, and a visitor offer that will really appeal to local people and UK tourists, because it's had a really strong international tourism focal point. And what we're doing there is working with different disciplines. So working with architects and creative industries more broadly, digital technologists, to think about how you take a site like Glastonbury, which for those of you who don't know, it has this really strong intangible heritage element where it's got all sorts of myths and legends and alternative spiritualities associated with it. So there are many, many different interpretations. So how do you take the archaeology, but also sort of digital methods, and think about how you can do layered interpretation and multivocality? So for me, this is really, they are looking for collaborations for academics, for archaeologists who will work with them in very different ways. And I think that these sort of crises mean that you can really pivot the way that people think about archaeology and the value of the contributions that we can make.
Thanks so much, Roberta. And I'd love to bring Sada in here. I don't know if you'd like to comment from the perspective of your work in Northeast Africa, and also underlining the point that Roberta just made about expertise in cultural theory as something that helps to frame these efforts.
Very much so. This is very interesting because I was going to actually say exactly Roberta's research very much links with what I've been doing in the Horn of Africa, looking at what has for a long time been seen as sites and archaeological places to study, to actually understanding them as sacred landscapes, and the archaeology being part of that sacred landscapes by following the local ontology, local belief systems, local cultures, and how they actually, the historical conscience in the narration of the locals about these sites. And the site that I focused on in Somaliland is called Obarkhadle, and it's actually a multi-religious site. That is the first site we have in the Somali Peninsula with a representation of pre-Islamic, pre-Christian heritage, but also other Abrahamic heritage such as Christianity and Judaism in the region. So, but when I visited there at the time, I came there to study fertility, because the women I've been interviewing about fertility were mentioned in this particular site. And it was a saint shrine, Sufi saint shrine. People go there for pilgrim. They walk around, they do the ziyarah, they give the custodians and the sheikhs some offerings, and that's it. But as an archaeologist walking there for the first time, we were able to say that actually this is not just a mausoleum for this sheikh, but this landscape, this place is actually, firstly, from the archaeological observations, a ruined town, a medieval ruined town, which now turns out to be potentially the first capital of the Odal Kingdom, which is a regional Islamic kingdom. We had no story of that, no knowledge of that before our research. But also, there are Christian burials, and not far from the area, there are also Jewish material. So all of a sudden we are uncovering, as Roberta was saying, layers of history, multivocality. And now, in fact, one of the things that we are doing, and I'm glad somebody mentioned Alif, but one of our projects, I'm the director of Horn Heritage Foundation, which is based in the Netherlands and in Somaliland. And it's a research and heritage preservation institution. So part of the research we are doing at this site is an archaeological excavation, looking at the deep history of this region, along with the narratives that we know of this place, whether it's the female-oriented rituals that have to do with fertility, or the more contested heritage, which is the multi-religious heritage. And we need this because these kinds of plural heritage help us understand, not only do they point us to what the earlier what we were saying about bringing a interdisciplinary research with heritage, and how different past facing academic disciplines can come together. So we're looking at the anthropology, we're looking at the rituals that take place, we're looking at the archaeology, we're looking at the ethnography of the place, because there have been people who have been excluded from the site after it's become something else, after it's become Christian, or after it's become Muslim. yet those people have not disappeared. They surround the community. They are there. And their words, their spirits, or dedicated places that are dedicated to spirits are linked to them. So you have not only layers of histories that we can now explain through sites like this, and in fact, push back on narratives that are dogmatic in our society and problematic, but also integrate disciplines and bring scholars together. And I have been in the, whether it's privileged or the contrary, it's been both, I must say, the first director of the Department of Archaeology in Somaliland, which I set up simply by doing a survey of the archaeological sites of Somaliland, and then meeting the president, showing him my laptop and saying, look, you have resources here. And then being granted funding for that, and then hiring local people. So then we're not just talking about archaeological academic disciplines or heritage as in managed by UNESCO and international agencies, but we are also talking about civil society and government, and we are talking about integrating many layers of heritage. And of course, as we've seen this panel, a lot of people with different hats, and it is the natural way to go. I think it's really a time that we expand the definition of heritage, and it's a great example, Helena's work, going to places where your approaches are welcome, where your approaches are supported. It's really important to develop, and I can very much relate to Helena's work also in working in a conflict zone and being one of the first people to work there, when everyone else is telling you, well, they don't need that. They need food, they need shelter, they need peace.
These are such powerful arguments. Thank you. And I just want to say to the audience, I haven't seen a flood of questions into Q&A, and my reading of that situation is that I get to pose one more question myself. But if anyone does want to ask the panelists a question, now would be the time to get that into Q&A, and we will get to that. So we've talked about some very sophisticated strategies around making contributions to heritage. But as various panelists have already emphasized, this requires also creative forms of collaboration. And Rachael, I wonder if I can come back to you here on the way you've been able to reach communities that are traditionally left out of the interpretation of the past in the UK.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in fact, just before I do, just to pick up on what Eleanor and Sada have said, I often, that's the first thing people say to me is, why would refugees need to work on cultural heritage? They need food, they need shelter, they need documents. And I completely agree with you, Sada, when you say that actually it's a human need for all sorts of reasons, but that won't answer Amy's question. Yeah, so I first of all, for my doctoral work, worked with street homeless people. And the way I went about that was by meeting homeless people, and it was quite organic. I learned a lot from took a much more ethnographic approach to that work, which sometimes involved, well, always involved participant observation, but before then involved developing proper relationships with people. Parachute in and say, hello, homeless people, I'm an archaeologist. I was wondering what it's like being homeless. can you show me to a genuine collaboration or co-curation? It's going to lead to either not having data that you need, or the archaeologist, the academic, doing the interpretation, and that's not what I'm interested in. So I think Bill Karaha, who is at North Dakota, wrote this brilliant paper on slow archaeology, what he calls slow archaeology, and it's about, in these very kind of ref-based, impact-based times, I think that there's a moral duty on us as archaeologists and academics. It's an imperative for us to make the effort to work with those communities who have traditionally been left out from interpretations of the past. And sometimes that means that we do have to be a bit more activist about things. So we do have to push back a little bit against the demands of funders or even the institution. Things need to take the time they need to take to build the relationships and to have the conversations and to go at a pace that's appropriate for the group of people that you want to build a collaboration with. So that might be laborers who don't have any formal education. That could be people who have particular disabilities which prevent them or make it more difficult for them to participate in ways that academia has traditionally required people to. But it also, I think there's aside from that, the sort of developing community projects with people who have traditionally been left out, and that goes the whole way through from research design, right the way through to presentation and co-collaboration in terms of co-production of your end result, and crediting as well, properly crediting people. But aside from that, I think there's also important work that needs to happen in terms of recognizing what it is that archaeology can inform, and I really do think that we are one of the few disciplines that is a bit of a magpie. We can and Lynn said this before, but we do have to be all these different things. We have to we have our own sort of discourse and it has its boundaries in some ways, but actually to make what we do relevant in the real world now, we also need to work and we need to understand, it needs to be transdisciplinary. We need to understand issues to do with sustainability and how that relates to human migration and capitalism and poverty and climate change and all of these things that they're not silos, and archaeology can speak to all of those. So the more that we collaborate with in terms of community archaeology, we also need to be making the same effort to collaborate with other academics in other departments and across institutions and particularly across national boundaries. I think I open the borders. I don't believe in national boundaries, and I think that heritage narratives have played a very important, dangerous role in strengthening national boundaries, and so the answer, we can also deconstruct some of those nationalist narratives through heritage. I think those are the types of collaborations I feel are important.
Rachael, thank you so much. And I see that we do have a couple questions coming through the Q&A. And I'd like to come back to Eleanor Robson actually, but first I think we'll take some questions from Q&A. And just to say, I should have explained that to the audience, we're just going to roll to 5 p.m. and we hope you can stay with us. Thank you for staying with us this far. There's a question particularly framed for Lynn. You seem to work in politically charged areas, mentioning the Middle East, South Africa, UNESCO. What is your secret?
I don't know that it's a secret. Well, I'm always angry. That's what I mentioned in the start. I mean, I do try. I don't know. I do try to pick projects that initially I think are uplifting. So I went to South Africa after Mandela. The sort of post-apartheid South Africa, you know, hoping to see these sort of changes. Maybe I'm just eternally disappointed. Yeah, so yeah, I guess also, you know, I would say the same of India, you know, that there's a lot of similarities, in fact. You know, I'm drawn to the post-colonial. I guess I also want to see how archaeology matters in these places, and sometimes that's conflictual, and I end up building institutional partnerships with people and taking students from those countries and doing these exchanges. But you know, I also don't seek trouble. Maybe trouble finds me, but you know, it's the same with UNESCO. I thought this was going to be a great story, and that, you know, this is changing the minds of men. Don't we all want to do that? That's UNESCO's preamble. And of course, it's also about world peace. So I guess I start all these projects rather naively thinking this might be my positive project, but it always, you know, as everybody has said, it becomes more complicated. There are, you know, colonial histories and legacies that we never shed. And yeah, I guess I don't know that it's a secret, but I always tell my students, you know, do something, you know, do a project that matters and matters to somebody. You know, it can't be about you. It's got to be about bigger issues. I don't know if that answers the question, but that just seems to be life. I'm sure Eleanor, Himanshu, everybody, you know, we're all, it's a similar story maybe.
Thank you. And these are all quite, they're very good, very challenging questions. And I don't know if anyone particularly would like to take on the next one, which is about a vision for archaeological and heritage research in the next 100 years. Where would you like to see developments made, or what areas do you believe will grow? And that's from Corey Highland, one of our DPhil students. Helena, can I call on you to share any thoughts there?
Unmute myself. Well, where is it going in the next 100 years? Well, I suppose touching on really what Lynn was just saying and others about nationalism. It's difficult to answer this question without sort of, to some extent, saying where you hope it's going to go as opposed to where you necessarily think it's going to go. But I do think in a way we may, I really hope, get through a very difficult period, which we're going through at the moment, of increasingly, in some ways, nationalistic heritages and an attempt to push back against other attempts to progress beyond that. But that we might get through that, and that indeed heritage might be one of those things that helps us actually counter nationalism and break some of that down. I mean, that's, you know, my, I'm starting to sound like Lynn before she actually gets engaged in these projects, where I've been very optimistic and hoping it's all going to happen. But I do think heritage genuinely, you know, could be quite a powerful force in challenging nationalist narratives. It already is, but I think even more so.
Thank you so much. And I wonder if I can go to Eleanor on that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the other element of this is the diversifying what we think of as heritage and who gets to decide what heritage is. We've talked a lot already about shifting the concept of bricks and mortar heritage towards a very people-centered approach. Is what I call the social and intellectual infrastructure of it. But then we also have to think about the environmental and the climatic, because that is just not going to go away, and that's going to be increasingly important, and thinking about what the past can teach us about how to live better in the present and future. And that's really what our work at the Mire Network is all about. So it might, yeah, I think that is very much our direction of travel in the next 10 years. I mean, and that's already hard to plan for, trying to develop we're trying to start to write a work plan for 10 years. And I'm thinking, well, let's take it 3 years at a time. So being asked to think about the next 100 is really very challenging indeed, I think.
Eleanor, can I ask something that I had wanted to ask you anyway? That was going back to the issue of what collaborations are important. As you formulate that plan, which sounds like it's very much a live document for the next 10 years, what are some of the keywords? What are some of the strategic local collaborations that you think are going to be fundamental?
Well, for us, it's, yeah, for me, it's always been about slowly developing trust relationships, as Rachel's already said. When we were in the early days of getting HRC funding, that funding bodies were talking about risk-taking with relationships. And I think particularly when working outside the UK in very structurally unequal relationships, that's the risk is almost always entirely on your partner if a relationship fails, because ultimately if I have a project that doesn't go nowhere, so what, I am a tenured professor and, you know, no big deal. But if my relationship that with a partner in Iraq or somewhere else in the world fails, that could have major repercussions. So the relationship building I've always sort of think about as a sort of a ripple thing there. I started off working very closely with people I've known for a very long time, and I've known their institutional context and been able to have conversations even with vice chancellors, etc., about what expectations and commitments were. And then so we've had this ripple effect and have been really building the network out from a core. And it's been just a joy to see how then there have been these second order networks growing as a result of that, and people come into contact with each other through us. And so I'm hoping that by the end of the 10 years that, you know, Paul and I can just retire and it will all just be self-sustaining without us. That's the idea. Always my aim in life is to make myself redundant.
I think it just remains for me to thank all of the panelists for all of the energy that they've put into this. We have some very appreciative comments in the chat. I hope the panelists have seen those. And to thank you, the audience, for sharing your Friday afternoon of what is the last week of term here in Oxford, and to wish you all well. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.